And for our final round of the day, we are going to get an update on tax increment financing from Emily Byrne and Becky Wasserman. Thanks for joining us.
I was going to go first.
Please do.
If that works.
Oh, yeah.
And if you don't see it on the website, use your refresh button. Stop saying that by next week. Everyone knows.
Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. So I prepared some slides that just give an overview of TIF and some legislative history about it for some context to the discussion that Emily will talk about in terms of the fiscal impact. Do you all have, are we ready to move forward? Okay. So the first slide is just an overview of how TIF works. It's an economic development financing tool for municipalities where they can use their bonding authority and their property taxes. And the idea is that they will borrow funds to invest in new infrastructure, and then that would stimulate private investment that would otherwise not have occurred. And then that combination of the public and private investment will end up increasing property tax values in the area where the TIF district is. There are some terms used in statute for TIF districts, and I thought I would just generally go over what they are so that when you hear them, you know what we're talking about. So the taxable value is that just, the assessed value of property that is subject to the state, municipal, or other taxes. And then in sort of TIF world, we talk about the original taxable value of a TIF district. And what we mean there is the total base taxable value of all the property that is in that district as of the date that the district is created. So it's when a district is created, you're sort of freezing the property values at that amount for the purposes of then calculating the tax increment. And that means that the increment is the difference between the property taxes that are due on the current taxable value of the property versus the property taxes due on the original taxable value. And I will talk about why that increment is important in a moment. And then in terms of financing, and I'll just note that some of these, how financing and related costs are defined have been sort of issues that have been brought to the legislature over the years in terms of changing these definitions. So just wanted to note what this means in case this comes back to the committee for discussion later. So financing means the debt incurred or borrowing used by a municipality to pay for improvements in a TIF district. Related costs are all the expenses incurred and paid by the municipality other than the actual construction and financing of improvements that are directly related to the creation of the TIF district. And statute uses an example like personnel costs associated with administering the TIF district. And then finally, the retention period is the period of time that a municipality is able to keep that portion of the total tax increment to finance the infrastructure improvement.
Question? Mm-hmm. A district. Is a district just a single piece of property usually, or is it an area to which
Yeah, it's used.
any piece of property will work?
Yeah, it's a combination of parcels that are, there's like a boundary of the district. And when a municipality applies for a TIF district, they are applying, to set those boundaries around certain parcels.
Okay, and it's usually more than just one parcel, it's a whole area of the municipality?
Yes, I'm trying to think of it. That's my understanding. I can't really think of an example where it would just be one. I'm not sure if Emily knows, but I think,
When you refer to the Winooski TIF district, that's like the whole of downtown Winooski. So-
Portion of it anyway.
yeah, so it's,
Applied for.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's,
So how a district is defined and how that definition might change throughout the life of the district is a subject of much controversy that we might be taking up later this session.
okay.
yeah, so,
So all the answers, are, yeah.
yeah, so I know that there was some language the last couple of years about, the boundaries of district are set, at the time the district was created, because I think there was a district that wanted to change one of the boundaries. So I think that question comes up in that context of, how the development is going, and maybe they might want to expand the boundaries of the district, and the legislature so far, I don't think has spoken on that issue.
We'll have, I can't imagine we're not gonna have time, because I imagine someone will bring us something at some point on this issue.
Is the retention period typically the same period as the term on the financing instrument?
Yeah, so it's a 20 years, I think, is to sort of be the same period of time that a bond would be. That being said, I'll get into this a little bit more, but that's the most TIF districts have 20-year retention periods, but there are some that have different ones. So in general, for most districts, and I'll explain what I mean by that in the next slide, is that for a 20-year period, the municipality may repay the borrowed funds that are used for the infrastructure by splitting their future property tax revenue. And so what happens is that they keep the property tax revenue that existed prior to development. So that's the amount of the property tax revenue on the original taxable value. And then they use a portion of the property taxes that are derived from the increase in the property tax value over time. And that's what's used to repay the financing and related costs for the infrastructure improvements. For most TIF districts, that split is 70-30 of the education property tax increment. And so the municipality keeps 70% of the increment and 30% goes to the ed fund. And then statute says that they have to keep at least 85% of their municipal property tax increment for this purpose. So they could keep more, just not less. And then at the end of the retention period, they can, the money goes back to, the split goes back to the way it was. The municipality and the state receive the full amounts.
Sorry. That first paragraph, keeping the property tax revenue that existed prior. Is that just the municipal property tax, not the education property tax, or does the education property tax go to the education fund?
Yeah, so that everything is the same for the original taxable value on the property stays the same in terms of the property assessment of the property for education and municipal property taxes. It's the increment.
Where it goes, that original, the taxes that are collected by the municipality for both schools and municipality, the schools portion on the original taxable value still goes to the education fund.
Right.
And the municipal, okay, that's what I was asking.
And it's just the increment that is then split.
I understand, okay.
Yeah, sorry, you looked like I was saying something wrong. Okay. And so on the next slide, what I meant by for most districts is that TIF has had a lot of different changes over the years and how they were first authorized. So there was sort of a split from like pre-2006 to post-2006 TIFs. And going back to 1985, that is when TIF was first authorized in statute. And at the time, from 1985 until 1998, it was really a municipal construct in that the state did not have any involvement in TIF. So they were using their own, a municipality with a TIF district. So the state involvement was just authorizing it, but the municipality with the TIF district would just be using their own property tax revenues to pay for the improvements. But then in 1997, when we had Access 60 that was passed, we established the statewide property tax. So at that time, this changed to allow the TIFs that existed at that time to be able to use the statewide property tax in addition to the municipal property tax to pay for financing and improvements in the district. Some TIFs prior to 2006 were created by special legislation from the legislature. And then after 2006, the way a TIF district was approved changed. So the first legislation enabling TIFs was in 1985, but the first TIFs were Burlington, their waterfront TIF district came about in 1996, and then Newport authorized a district in 97. And then in Act 60, that changed the education property tax. These two TIF districts were sort of grandfathered into being able to use the state education property tax increment. And then there was also some additional legislation in 1998 that authorized the Milton North-South District.
It's okay.
And then Winooski created their district in 2000. Oh, wait a minute. A very happy jingle.
Can we start with 1998?
1998. Let's go back to 1998. Milton North-South TIF District was approved under sort of a special legislation, and then in 2000, the Winooski TIF District was created. So the next slide. In 2006, the legislature changed the TIF approval process such that the General Assembly would not be sort of individually approving TIF districts. Little did they know. Sorry.
I appreciate it. A little in the afternoon goes a long way.
That such that VEPSI would approve, administer the approval process and the framework for new TIF districts. It was at this time in 2006 that the percentage split came about for the statewide property tax revenue. And at that time, it was a 75-25% split. I think that Emily's slides will go into more detail on this, but the new framework also set up certain location and project criteria for what was needed to be in a TIF district in order for it to be approved. The new framework also made it clear that districts could not retain more than 20 years of statewide property tax revenue from the time that debt was first incurred. So that's kind of the similar to what we have now. And on the next slide, I just have a split between the districts that were created prior to VEPSI's approval process. Two of those are currently retired. And then there's districts subject to the VEPSI approval process. Of the ones that were approved by VEPSI, Colchester has been dissolved, and Montpelier, which was recently approved by them, actually just recently became inactive and dissolved. And then Killington was just approved this year.
And are there certain rules that are required to create a TIF?
Yeah, so in statute,
No, go ahead.
in statute,
I just keep on missing it
Yeah.
again, so I want to make sure I had seen it.
like VEPSI basically requires TIF district, a municipality has to vote to create a TIF district. And they have to vote also to incur the debt for it, but they have to submit a plan to VEPSI. And that plan they have to make sure that they meet like the project and location criteria and other requirements for VEPSI in order to be approved. And I think part of VEPSI does sort of a financial analysis to see, will this investment actually bring in the revenue to pay back the debt that you're going to incur?
And then what's the location criteria? And maybe this is in your,
I think maybe Emily's slides just have more details, but
Okay.
if you go back to the other slides, you need 2 of 3 location criteria. So
sorry,
the district has to be in a high density, compact area or
sorry, I
located
missed it.
in an industrial area, or it has to be within an improved downtown center, designated downtown village center, new town center, or neighborhood development area, or it is an economically distressed area. And then statute also says there's like a but-for requirement, like the investment would not happen but for this TIF tool being used.
And not at all. What triggers a dissolution of a TIF district? Like, is there a natural sunsetting process, or does it have to be proactively pursued?
So you can, once you've paid off the debt, I think that's when statute like triggers that the district, once you retire your debt, the district becomes, I think, inactive. But then the Montpelier situation, I think they actually voted to, maybe Emily has something.
I think you have to incur,
for the record.
Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office, you have to incur your debt within 5 years of the authorization. So I think like in the case of Montpelier, they were not gonna meet their 5-year thing, so they have to.
Okay.
Yeah, there's an ability to ask for an extension of an additional 5 years, and I think Montpelier chose not to do that.
So for these I believe it was 96 districts of Winooski and Burlington, those that aren't retired according to what's on the slide, do they just get to be grandfathered forever? Like, I'm just trying to.
So some of my slides later on, there have been extensions on a lot of these, the older districts.
Thank you.
In Burlington, the waterfront in particular has had a few of those. On the next slide, in terms of caps, I just wanted to note that the legislature has sort of looked at how many TIF districts should be in the state a number of times. So going back to 2006, there was a cap of 10 districts with no more than 1 per town for a 5-year period, and that ended in 2011. And then 2008, they put another cap in of 6 districts with no more than 1 per town for a 5-year period. In 2013, there was a big TIF bill, and in that bill, they actually prohibited any additional districts other than those that were already approved, except for the case of South Burlington, which was at that time having their approval pending. And then just sort of most recently, there is a cap in statute right now of 6 more for the entire state and no more than 2 per county. So I think with Montpelier dissolving it, that there are 4 that can still be up for grabs at this point. But I wanted to note that statute in Title 32 actually gives the emergency board the discretion to increase this six district cap if the legislature is not in session.
So that would be a TIF emergency.
A TIF, yeah, there's a TIF emergency.
Hard to imagine.
Emergency board.
Very hard to imagine. Let's see, it seems like a fairly slow planful process. Okay.
Pandemic.
So in terms of tax increment, as I mentioned, Burlington has had their TIF increment extended, both municipal and education property taxes. And then in 2017, the sort of split about the increment was changed to a 70-30 split. And that's when they also added the at least 85% of municipal increment. And then on the next page, I won't read through all of these, but there have been a number of times that the legislature has extended the period for a TIF district to incur debt. So as Emily mentioned, in statute, you have 5 years from the date the district is created to incur your debt. And then you can get approval granted by BEPC to have another 5 years if you don't meet that deadline. And then the legislature has extended outside of that as well for a number of districts. In 2021, all the TIF districts had their period to incur debt extended by 1 year. And then on my last slide, I just wanted to note some considerations for the legislature that are in statute. So Emily is going to talk about the latest TIF report. So JFO in statute has to do a report every 4 years. But in addition to that, there is a statutory requirement that each year the General Assembly has to consider the amount of new long-term net debt that prudently may be authorized for TIF districts in the next fiscal year, and determine whether to expand the number of TIF districts or similar economic development tools. And then in addition to that, every year, the E-Board, JFO, and the Secretary of Administration has to provide a consensus estimate of the impact of TIF districts on the Ed Fund for the prior fiscal year. And then the E-Board has to adopt an official estimate of that impact.
Two slides back. Actually, number 11, the second Act 69, 217. Dedicate at least 85% of the municipal increment to debt service?
To pay for financing and improvements. Yeah, it's just the sort of the percentage of the increment, the portion of the increment that they have to put towards the TIF district versus they can keep 15% of the increment to use for other.
And when they put it towards they're just spending it, it's not necessarily debt service or anything, they're just using it to invest in the TIF district?
It's to pay back the debt, the financing, whatever the debt was they incurred, and the related costs.
Okay.
You were doing an exemplary job identifying some of the key sort of wiggle areas that get discussed in defining TIFs. So one of the other ones is, it's very impressive. So one of the other ones is exactly what that increment can be spent on and what counts as sort of debt service versus planning money versus, so yeah, another very clear question. Yeah, Representative.
Does the increment constitute an expenditure in the education fund? I mean, does it?
So the portion.
Or a portion of it?
Yeah, the increment that the municipality is keeping from the education property tax is not going to the Ed Fund.
Right, so does it?
So there's a
tax expenditure?
It's a fiscal impact on the Ed Fund. I don't know that it's a tax expenditure. I will have Emily.
Emily, do you want to just wait until your presentation to speak to that? Okay. Representative Bodie?
Since there's this, I can't remember the name of it because it's back a few slides, but there's a board or an organization that's overlooking all this. Do they, couldn't, Bepsi's, thank you. Wouldn't they just kind of clarify what some of those questions are? Sorry.
So Vepsi in 2015 did have a rulemaking to try to clarify some of these questions. I think.
Then what happened?
So I think, sorry, I'm trying to figure out a way to answer. I think for each TIF district, there have been sort of unique situations that have come up for them that aren't always clear under the law. So they've, I think they try to address it as best they can under the rule and the law, but if there is something that maybe people disagree on is when it kind of has ended up here. And debt service payments is one of the areas where it has sort of been identified as unclear whether the definition of, I believe it's of improvements in the statute can cover debt service payments.
So does Vepsi look at the law, the regulations, and then the intent, which is to allow allow TIFs to go forward and then say, okay, it's just not clear enough. Now we have to go back to House Ways and Means.
I think sometimes there's a difference between how VEPSI interprets intent and how we interpret intent.
Do we have intent written in that? Does anybody know who would allow somebody, what is the intent written in the statute?
I don't think there's actually any intent with respect to, there's no intent section that I'm aware of. I don't want to speak for Vepsi on how they would interpret those questions, but there have definitely been situations where I think they don't agree with the town that has said, we think we can do this, or where the legislature and Vepsi might not have the same, agreement on something.
Representative?
Still just trying to wrap my head around this. Any community can apply and Bepsi approves becoming a TIF, and there's only like a certain number available?
There's only, I think, 4 left that are up for grabs. Any municipality could apply, they just have to meet the requirements. I mean, I think arguably it is harder for a smaller town with, the grand list that is not going to be able to, help them pay back the debt they incurred to make use of TIF. And because of that, the last couple of years, there have been there was a proposed legislation to have those sort of mini TIFs or project-based TIFs. But, technically, anyone could apply as long as they don't go over their cap, although the legislature could always change that cap, and I guess so could the emergency board.
The planning process is also quite lengthy and expensive, is my understanding.
Yeah, so I think, I don't want to say this with any authority, but I'm sure a town that doesn't have, somebody to help with all the application process, it might be more difficult for them to go through the process, but I'm sure Vepsi can give more insight into that.
And so there are 4 slots and 5 communities apply,
I think it's just in the order that you apply.
just come for serve as long as you meet the criteria.
Or actually, I don't know how they do it. It might be in the order of how they're approved. So I can follow up with Vepsi on that.
And if and when we get a TIF-related bill that we decide to spend some time on, we would have Vepsi in to discuss it, and we would get to dive into all the naughty bits. Meaning with a knot in a piece of wood. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. Any other questions? Emily, do you want to dive into the impact on the education fund activity? That kind of not. Oh my goodness. Thanks. May your ties always match the themes of my embarrassing moments.
All right. Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. I'm sure you've missed me since the last time I saw you yesterday. But I'm going to do a sort of high-level TIF update. I am going to repeat some of the stuff that Becky just went through, just because it helps to hear it more than once. At least that's been my experience in coming up to speed on how TIFs work and that kind of stuff. So jump right in. I would highlight the TIF, and most of the information that I'm going to present comes out of the TIF report that was published by the Joint Fiscal Office last year. I didn't write it, Graham Campbell wrote it, so you should get credit for all of the work, but you can find the full report on the JFO website. I put a link in the presentation if you're interested in reading more about it. Really good report. It's really good. It is dense though. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I read it over multiple days the first time I read it because it was like a lot of information to try to digest, but it's great. And we've done, Graham's written both of them. It's an every 4-year report. So there is one from 2017, I think. Because the 2022 report that came out got pushed a year because of COVID stuff. So it's on a 4-year cycle. But that's right. What is a TIF? High level used by municipalities to finance the economic development by diverting a portion of the growth in future property tax revenues. Before I forget to answer the question earlier, yes, it is a tax expenditure of the education fund.
Does it show up on their tax expenditure report?
It's in the tax expenditure report that Pat presented yesterday. It doesn't show up anywhere on the education fund,
I was
though.
looking for it yesterday, couldn't find it, so thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, and it doesn't show up on the education fund outlook that Julia has brought in. It goes into the calculations in terms of what's the grand list tax base. So it kind of gets taken off, that increment gets taken off the grand list tax base when she runs the model to calculate yields. So it's in there. It's buried in way back in the details, but it's not explicit on there. Sure. So the steps to create a TIF: municipality wants to improve a geographic area, downtown plot, blighted area, brownfield, by investing in infrastructure. So if there were sidewalks, if there was sewer access, if there was parking and streetlights in this area of town, business would come in and then there'd be improvements. But without that infrastructure, the logic is that the businesses won't come in. That's the number 2 part, stimulate private development. The municipality finances the infrastructure improvements with borrowed funds, so it goes to the market to get those funds, and then they use the tax increment to pay back the debt service. The chart on slide 4, I think, is a really good visualization of sort of what all of that means and kind of gets at that. So that blue piece at the very bottom, that's the sort of base revenue. So that is what property tax was being generated by that parcel before the TIF district went into effect. And that base revenue that's generated based on the value at the time that the TIF district goes into effect goes to the municipality and the education fund. The red box is the tax increment. So that's the sort of additional value that those parcels gain when these investments are made. That increment, that over and above that base value, is what gets the 70% of the education fund piece. The town gets to retain. Most recent ones, generally 70% gets retained per current law. 70% gets retained by the town. 30% of that increment goes to the education fund, and then they retain 85% of the municipal tax to meet the debt service obligations, and then the remainder goes in. And then after that 20-year period ends, that new tax base goes to where it's supposed to go. So it goes to the municipality or the education fund. Another question that came up when Becky was testifying, and I think I probably talk about it in later slides, but I don't want to forget to mention it, is that the retention period is 20 years, right, which aligns with most municipal bond periods. That's from when you do your first debt issuance. You can do more debt issuance after the fact, but the 20-year period doesn't change. So that first, you have your increment for the 20 years that aligns with that first debt issuance. But if you have a later debt issuance, your 20-year period doesn't move out unless you get permission to get it extended, et cetera. So it is possible that you will have debt whose time period, I'm trying to figure out how to time period is longer than when your increment ends, right? Is a possibility. And I think that's part of the analysis that BEPC would do to figure out okay, if you're going to do some bonding at a later date and some of that bonding won't be covered by the increment anymore because your increment timeline expires, can the municipality pick up the remaining debt service associated with that sort of later bonding?
How much for each TIF that's does the slope look similar to this towards the new tax base? Do folks make estimates?
Yeah.
Do we know that actuals align with initial estimates, or do we find that people, tax base grows more than expected or don't meet targets?
Complicated. This chart I would say is just for
illustration.
Illustrated.
I'm wondering how
slope is.
Often is the
Complicated. Part of the value, one of the things, and I'll get into it a little bit later, part of the analysis that Graham did in the TIF report is that the value, that base revenue is set the day that when the district goes into effect. And that there's no assumed change in the base value of the property, even though in all likelihood, grand list is going to, with or without the TIF district, the grand list would have grown. But there's no assumed, there's
no adjustment.
There's no adjustment, right? So it's just, this was the value on the day. If it grows because you do all of the things you said you were going to do in your application, you get to keep it. If it grows and you don't do all the things you said in your application, but you do some of them, you get to keep the full, you keep whatever that delta is, sort of regardless of what happens. So it's complicated. Hopefully that makes some sense. So I'll keep moving. Slide 5 is repetitive from Becky's presentation, but it is some of those definitions because I think good to hear them again or good to read them again in terms of what the increment is. The ones I'll highlight, right? Increment is the difference in the property value, and the tax increment is the change in the tax associated with the increment. And the retention period is the period of the time the municipality could keep that tax increment to finance the infrastructure. The next one is, again, just restating how much can be retained. So 70% of the statewide increment, meaning the education fund component, can be retained. And the municipality has to retain at least 85% of their tax to meet their debt service obligations. And then the older TIF districts that went into effect prior to that change in the law can retain different amounts. So the overall district improvements must include 3 of the following things is what you can use your TIF money on. So developing beyond the municipal bonding or operating expenditures of the municipalities, to fund new affordable housing, to remediate a brownfield, for new or expansion of existing businesses, or improvements in traffic and transportation to try to drive that private investment. It cannot be used to subsidize private development in the area. So it's really just supporting the infrastructure that would then draw in the private development.
Is there beeping somewhere inside my own head?
Sounds like it's outside.
Okay, great.
So the next table, we pulled this from an older report, so it doesn't have, it's still got Montpelier on it and doesn't have Killington. But just to give you a sense of what, when they were created and what the debt periods are for the towns that currently have open TIF districts. And to give you, it gives you a sense of the original taxable values of those TIF districts, which vary from, I think the highest one, Burlington downtown, is $170 million. And the Newport City one, which is, Newport City is also retired. But yeah, I'm trying to find the low one, 33 million in Hartford. So you have 20 years from when you first incur debt for the district. That's when your clock starts. And that's 5 years from when you are authorized to be a TIF district. And the Burlington waterfront is a complicated one, and I don't know enough of the details to speak to it, but just wanted to note that they can retain debt on those 3 parcels until 2035. Or retain increment, sorry, to pay back debt on those 3 parcels. So where can the TIFs be established? It's not everywhere. You have to meet 2 of 3 criteria. So it has to be a high density area in a designated downtown or in an economically distressed area. An economically distressed area for this purpose means 80% or less of the median state income, average annual unemployment of 1% higher than the state, a median home sale price that's 80% or less than the state average. So that, I think sometimes that can play into whether or not more rural areas are able to access TIF, because if it's not high density or a designated downtown, you have to meet high density or a designated downtown and the economically distressed test to qualify. Yeah.
And just to clarify, on the median home sales price, did you say 80% or less? Because the slide says 80% less.
Oh yeah, 80% less than the state average, sorry, yeah. Yeah.
And so,
They don't sale price 80% less.
No.
That just seems a little extreme.
Yes, can't be less.
It has to be 80% of,
The state, I think that should be in,
can't be
Yeah,
80%.
I was like, those are some low.
Whoa, that's a bargain.
it's probably 80% of the median home
Yeah.
sale price.
Thank you.
Median home sale price. I wonder if I'm missing a comma there. Oh, I will get back to you on that one.
looking back to the newly created TIF, I'm trying to understand any
Killington.
sense of, how that qualifies under these criteria.
Let me get back to you. I know that they did have the economically distressed. They had their unemployment rate, I believe, in Killington is higher. Yes, is seasonal, and I think that drove how they,
Qualified them as an economically distressed area.
I believe so. But let me follow up
Thank you.
on that one.
It's interesting. Yes.
Emily, any information on why the Winooski and Burlington TIF districts got, well, I guess the Burlington, the waterfront one got extended to 30 years retention period, but any idea why their retention amount got increased?
Yes, those were the 2 that were in place prior to the legislation that said you can keep 70%.
So Burlington gets to keep 100% for 30 years?
In the waterfront district.
Waterfront
They
district,
have multiple
right,
They have 2 TIFs.
right.
Yes.
I guess that's a lot of state ed funding that's not being captured by the state, I guess I'm just curious about. I'd love to see a quantification of that.
Sure.
I think the specific example in Burlington is just I think that there was actually some property value loss on some of the parcels in the waterfront.
At some point, like maybe back in 2008 or something.
think currently there is some development that hasn't happened yet on some of the parcels, so.
So that's, I mean, that's interesting, the original taxable value there. I wonder what it is today and, you know, what the increase has been or loss has been. It's really, that's interesting.
One of the other questions that has come up a few times is if there's loss of value, who carries that loss? Who doesn't carry that loss?
Right.
I'm realizing that we have a lot of slides left and.
No, sorry.
No, not towards you. I just realized, so I don't.
No worries, they should be quick. Yeah, and I'm glad we're gonna not talk about decrement, because I was like, oh, I want to go there, which is the opposite situation where if the property loses value, do you owe the education fund money?
I think that's a conversation for another day.
Yes,
The
definitely.
word decrement, I think, really improves the quality of that conversation.
Slide 9 is just a visual of where the TIF districts are. This did come out of the VEPSI 2022 report and was before Montpelier was retired and before Killington is on the map. I don't know why Killington's not on the list that came out of the report, but just as a snapshot of where they are. Becky went through these pieces, but just this is a quick list of where the most recent extensions of debt periods. During COVID, there was an extension for all districts due to COVID, just because construction didn't, with the suspension of construction as a result of the pandemic response. Stuff couldn't continue to move forward. And there is an update to the TIF rule that's forthcoming that ACCG is working on as we speak. So fiscal impacts on the state. So Becky spoke about this but-for question. So this is the idea is demonstrating to VEPSI that but for the existence of the TIF district, the development wouldn't happen. One way we sort of think about that, like if that is 100% true, then TIF wouldn't really cost anything because we would be gaining all of those funds and all the sort of like the increment through that investment in the TIF district. Because if it didn't have, like, if none of that improvement happened, then we would never get the improvement to the grand list associated with the TIF. On the other hand, if it's not true, if TIF has nothing to do with whether or not these things would have occurred, then that's sort of diverting the state municipal dollars from the education fund didn't really need to happen. So sort of where does it land in terms of that but-for question? How do you demonstrate that? How do you make that determination? And that's something that VEPSI does. So the report that Graham put together sort of outlines sort of three perspectives on this. VEPSI's annual report kind of makes the assumptions that TIF was necessary for all of this to occur, and that there was an estimated almost $1 million, almost $950,000 in new education fund revenues were generated in 21 as a result of the TIF districts. So that's the sort of 30% that gets retained by the education fund. And that will grow in 2023 based on the additional development and the changes in the values in the TIF district. The JFO side, we kind of thought through, as I touched on before, this idea of the assumption that there would be, there's an assumption that there is no natural growth in the value of those properties when the TIF district goes into effect. So the JFO analysis tried to look at like, okay, well, we should net the natural growth in property values over the 20-year period, and then look at whether or not there is a benefit to the fund. And the analysis sort of showed that had nothing happened, we would have seen $5 to $7 million worth of growth in the education fund as a result of those properties from 23 to 28, and then $4 to $7 million between 29 and 34, and that should be netted against any benefit. And similarly, municipal general funds would have had growth also because those properties would have had value changes. I will note, to the extent these were done last year, changes in grand list values that have occurred since then, which I know you've probably taken testimony on already, aren't in there, right? And that's the other thing, to the extent that there's growth in the grand list that's sort of outside, that happens because of other economic forces. If you set the base amount in one period and then things happen in the economy that drive up property values over and above that, you get the benefit of retaining the additional increment. You as this municipality get the benefit of retaining that additional increment from that growth that sort of may have nothing to do with the TIF districts, may just have to do with property values going up faster than anticipated in the state. And then the third one, this was adopted by the emergency board on Tuesday. Is the official consensus estimate that in 2024, we assume that the cost to the education fund based on the increment that will be retained is $7.8 million. So
Just to summarize, I'm hearing a rather significant costs that collectively we're investing in to support development in particular communities that meet very certain criteria.
So go to, what am I on? Slide 12. Fiscal impacts to municipalities. So the ed fund increments retains a portion of the fundings used to pay the debt service to improve the district. Act 69, 2017 required municipalities to contribute at least 85% of the increment. But some districts contribute 100%. They have to sort of do that math internally to figure out what they need. They got to pay the debt service regardless. And they retain the increment. A lot of that increment will get set aside specifically to continue to pay that debt service. And I think, as I touched on this before, some of the TIF district financing plans will go beyond that 20-year retention period just because of the timing of if they did a second bond issuance that goes past the 20-year period. The initial 20-year period that's set, then they end up with that the obligation to pay back those bonds past the increment retention period. So in the report, there are some considerations for the legislature that were outlined. And I think some of these, there was a bill last year, I believe S33, that didn't make it over the finish line that tried to address some of these things.
I think that was passed out of this committee and the House and didn't move in the Senate, just for context.
So some of the highlights that are in the report, this is, if you want to read the report, great. If you want to read the executive summary, these are the sort of high bullet points from the executive summary. Try to distill them down even further, but if you want to get more meat, look to the executive summary. It does a good job summarizing the report. But the TIF statute continues to limit the downsides and excesses of TIF. I think in other states and municipalities, TIF doesn't. There isn't as many rules and people paying attention to TIF, so that kind of gets a little out of control. But Vermont's generally doing a good job of paying attention to what's going on. But it is administratively challenging. Yeah.
Other states with TIFs, though, is there this sort of collective obligation?
The education fund?
Like the education fund?
No, I don't believe so.
So other states that have less rules, also, the risk is entirely held by the community that has the TIF.
I believe so. TIF is administratively challenging, I think, both for municipalities and for the state, in terms of dealing with the unpredictability of TIF. When you submit your application, there's a lot of assumptions about what construction is going to cost and when things will get done, and the universe changes and those plans change. We also are, one of the strengths of Vermont's TIF is that the auditor's office has to do independent audits of all of the TIF districts and spends a lot of time doing that. We touched on the estimates in terms of what the costs are for the education fund annually. overall economic impacts of TIF are mixed. It does drive development into downtowns to the extent one of the requirements is that it has to be a designated downtown. But how do you necessarily attribute all of the growth in that designated area to the existence of the TIF?
And I would say the Killington example makes me even wonder what a downtown is anymore. Record, no shade on Killington.
Yeah.
It's just another way that these definitions are more unclear than I think like our base assumptions of them might be.
This one, the next bullet touches on a question that was brought up earlier, but the characteristics of the TIF program likely prevent the existing TIF program from being used widely in rural areas, partly like the criteria for where the TIF can be. Half the TIFs that we currently have are in Chittenden County. The scale of the improvements that would need to be done in some of these downtowns to pull businesses in may make it financially challenging for them to do it, and the administrative capacity to actually enroll in, it's a big administrative challenge, and small towns likely just don't have the capacity to undertake the analysis and the application process and all that. The current amount and approach to the debt in the TIF districts is conservative, but in some districts are in riskier positions than others. And I think just like a lot of these TIF districts and their applications were all done pre-COVID and pre-construction, the current sort of challenges and with inflation in the construction. So how that changes, whether or not how much they're going to end up needing to bond for in order to complete the projects and what these things are going to cost, and whether or not the increment that exists on the grand list will be sufficient enough to cover those changes in costs, I think is an open question everywhere. I want to make sure, should I keep going? Sure.
I think you just have one slide, right? 2?
3 quick ones, like, yeah, 2.5.
Let's fly through and then we'll come back to it.
Great. So then there's sort of 3 other high-level recommendations. Thinking about BEPC's role as both the monitoring and regulatory agency. So could there be more formal analysis sort of statewide of the economic and fiscal impacts? Should there be more in-depth feasibility studies about whether or not the existence of the TIF and the keeping of the increment will successfully result in the downtown development? And more evaluation about whether TIF is necessary to do the infrastructure improvements. Legislature may want to ask for more detailed updates in each district and more frequent reporting from districts and when that reporting happens. For example, with the current, economic climate, should everybody resubmit TIF plans or, some sort of update based on what they think things are going to cost given the new economic climate and the ability to find people to do the work. Administrative process, it's a little unpredictable and complicated to administer, and that can be challenging. And there's, some Representative Kornheiser kind of alluded to, like there are some very specific details that, the devil's in the details in terms of how to implement parts of the TIF law, and should it be in statute, should it be in rule? And the last one is just a bigger picture, thinking about resources for municipal infrastructure construction. I think we touched on, it's currently not necessarily accessible to rural areas as an option for financing. And given that there's money out there, is TIF really the best way to move money to towns for infrastructure improvements? Is really the big legislative question, I think.
And on that note, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Look forward to these issues in greater depth at another time, and we will see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
I think, maybe you're not. I didn't really look at the agenda that said that.
I'll just come visit.
And folks, going to the floor. After the floor, we are not coming back here, but we'll see the rest of the committee tomorrow at 9.